Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to go a little deeper? Today, we're diving into the story behind Singapore's economic success. Everyone's heard how they're like the poster child for free markets, right? But we're about to find out it's way more interesting than that.
It definitely is.
We're digging into this article, Se pegó el texto. And let me tell you, it gets right to it.
Oh, yeah.
First thing it says, forget this whole Singapore success is all about low taxes and being good for businesses. The article says that's not really the starting point, more like a result of some serious government planning.
Interesting.
So it wasn't just letting the free market do its thing then. This article says it's more like a political miracle. And the big name that keeps coming up, Lee Kuan Yew, their prime minister for, what was it, like 30 years?
Even longer. Lee Kuan Yew was prime minister from 1959 all the way to 1990. And his influence over the economy, let's just say, he definitely had a frame hand on the wheel.
So what did he do that was so different? This article talks about how the government got control of a ton of land back in the 60s, something about using it for development.
Right. In the 1960s, they passed the Land Acquisition Act. It basically let the government buy up land if they said it was for, the public good.
So they could just, take it?
Pretty much. They used it to build housing, infrastructure, all that. But the big thing is, even now, the government still controls the vast majority of land in Singapore.
Wow. So they still have a huge say in what gets built where. I guess it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, the article says something like 80% of Singaporeans live in public housing.
That's right, 80%. It's one of the highest rates in the world.
But get this, the article says most of them, even if they've bought their apartments, they don't actually own them.
It's true. Most public housing in Singapore is sold on a 99-year lease.
99 years. That's wild. So after that, it goes back to the government.
Yep, back to the government. It's definitely a unique system. Proponents say it's kept housing relatively affordable, which is a huge issue in other big cities, right? But of course, it also means the government has a lot of control.
That's quite a trade-off. And it's not just housing, right? The article mentions this thing called Temasek Holdings. What is that? Some kind of giant corporation?
It is big, yes. But it's not just any corporation. Temasek Holdings is what's known as a sovereign wealth fund. It's basically an investment fund owned by the government.
So, the government using its money to invest in everything. Because the article made it sound like they're involved in all sorts of stuff.
They really are. We're talking banking, telecommunications, even a theme park. Their portfolio is massive and incredibly diverse, which gives them a significant influence on Singapore's economy as a whole, way beyond what you'd normally see from, say, a state-owned oil company or something.
Okay, so we've got the government super involved in land, housing, and now we see they're a major player in all sorts of industries. And yet, everyone talks about Singapore being the ultimate pro-business country.
It's true. Singapore has a reputation for being very welcoming to foreign businesses. But again, it's more nuanced than just opening the doors and saying, come on in.
How so?
Their approach has always been very strategic. They haven't just wanted any foreign company to set up shop. They've focused on attracting businesses that could provide what they saw as essential, transferring technology and knowledge to Singaporean companies and workers.
Yeah.
They were playing the long game.
So it's more like they saw foreign investment as a way to build up their own industries over time.
Exactly. A good example of this is when you compare it to somewhere like, say, Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a lot of foreign companies, but they haven't had the same level of, you could call it, government guidance in attracting and utilizing those investments.
And that's made a difference.
It's a big factor. It's one reason why Singapore's economy has taken off in a way that Bangladesh's, despite also having lots of foreign investment, hasn't quite been able to match.
Fascinating. So it's not just about being pro-business. It's about being strategic about it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so they're playing chess, not checkers. They're thinking long-term, building up industries, using foreign investment strategically.
Yeah.
What else? This article mentioned education, too. How does that fit in?
Well, think about it. If you're trying to build a high-tech, advanced economy...
You need skilled workers.
Exactly. And Singapore has consistently invested heavily in education and training to make sure their workforce has the skills they need to compete globally.
So it's not just about basic literacy, it's about training people for the jobs of the future.
That's a big part of it, yeah. And they've been very good at adapting their education system to meet the changing needs of the economy.
Okay, so this is definitely not your Econ 101 free market fairy tale.
Yeah.
And yet, this article, even after all this talk about government planning and control, It goes on to call Singapore a tax haven. How does that fit into the picture?
Ah, well, that's where things get even more interesting and a little more controversial.
Yeah.
Yeah, the tax haven label is definitely controversial. It brings up all sorts of questions about, fairness, global inequality.
Right, because on the one hand, you've got this very hands-on government deeply involved in shaping the economy.
Right.
But then they also seem to be totally fine with letting companies and wealthy individuals use Singapore to, well, avoid paying taxes elsewhere.
It's a good point, and it's something Singapore has faced criticism for, no question. But it's also important to remember context is everything. When Lee Kuan Yew came to power, Singapore was a new country with, frankly, not a lot going for it. They were poor. They had very few natural resources.
They needed to find a way to make things work, and fast.
Exactly, and they were willing to be pretty pragmatic about it. If that meant attracting foreign capital, even if it meant some people might call them a tax haven, well, they saw it as a means to an end.
And it's hard to argue with their success. But the article also makes it clear that this success didn't come without a cost. There's this whole other side to the Singapore story, right? The social controls, the limits on individual freedoms. It even mentions the chewing gum ban.
Yeah, that's kind of become a famous example, but it is indicative of a broader point. Singapore has always prioritized order and efficiency, sometimes arguably at the expense of individual expression.
Yeah, the article makes a pretty bold claim. It suggests that this emphasis on the collective good over individual freedom is a fundamental difference between, say, a Western model of development and a more Asian one.
It's a fascinating argument, and whether or not you agree with it, it does make you think. Is there some inherent tension between rapid economic growth and individual liberty? Is it even possible to have both?
Those are huge questions, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
Yeah.
But it's something to keep in mind as we, look at different models of economic development around the world. Because Singapore is a really interesting case study. So we've talked about the government, foreign investment, education.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the people who actually live in this system? What's it like to be a Singaporean in this kind of tightly controlled, highly efficient society?
That's a key question, and I think it's important to acknowledge that from a material standpoint, Singaporeans enjoy a very high standard of living. Their healthcare system is world-class, the infrastructure is incredible, and the government's role in things like housing and food security means that even though it's an expensive city,
It's manageable.
more or less, yes, compared to, say, New York or London.
Okay. But what about opportunity? Do you feel like there's a sense of social mobility in Singapore? That anyone can climb the ladder if they work hard enough?
That's where it gets a bit more complicated. Singapore talks a lot about meritocracy. Work hard, get ahead. And while there's truth to that, there are also limitations. Their education system, for example, is very competitive, very high stakes. It produces great results, but puts a lot of pressure on kids from a very young age.
I can see how that could be tough.
And there's still a significant wealth gap, even with the government's social safety net programs. So it's a mixed bag, like most things.
Right. You've got the high standard of living, but maybe less freedom. And it's not always easy to move up the economic ladder, even if you're born and raised in this system.
Exactly.
And all of this, of course, is happening against the backdrop of this article that's basically calling Singapore an economic parasite.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to put it. And it's a view that's out there for sure. People who see Singapore's success as being somehow extractive, built on taking advantage of other countries.
So this idea of Singapore as a parasite, it's a strong word. What do you make of it?
Well, like a lot of things, it depends on how you look at it. On the one hand, globalization is all about interdependence, right? Countries specialize, they trade, ideally everyone benefits. But of course,
It doesn't always work out that way.
right. And the argument is that Singapore has been very good at, let's say, maximizing its gains from this system, sometimes at the expense of other countries. The tax haven thing is part of it, but also just, being a hub for finance and trade, attracting talent and investment.
Which might otherwise have gone elsewhere.
Exactly.
It's definitely something to think about. Because when you look at the whole picture, it's hard to deny that Singapore has been incredibly successful on its own terms. They've created a society with a high quality of life, a strong economy,
Right.
but it's also a society that's very much a product of its own unique history, its own particular circumstances.
Absolutely.
So where does that leave us? I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen the free market narrative, the government planning side, the social controls, the tax haven debate. It's a lot to process.
It is, and I think that's the point, really. There's no simple answer here, no single takeaway. Singapore's story is complex, it's full of contradictions.
That's what makes it so fascinating.
Exactly. It challenges us to think critically about the relationship between economics and politics, between growth and equality, individual freedom, and the collective good.
It's not just an academic exercise. These are real issues playing out all over the world.
Absolutely. And as always, the more we understand these complexities, the better equipped we are to, engage in these debates and hopefully make more informed decisions, both individually and as a society.
Well said. So, to our listeners, we want to hear from you.
Hmm.
What do you think? Does Singapore's model challenge any of your assumptions about how economies work? What are your takeaways from this deep dive? A huge thank you to expert speaker for joining us today and for sharing your insights. Always a pleasure.
It was great being here. Thank you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on another deep dive. We'll be back soon with more conversations that make you think, make you question, and hopefully make you see the world a little differently. Until then, keep exploring.